Have you ever stopped to consider that what we call Rome's greatness was built in large part on invisible chain? Well, while books extol generals, emperors, and monuments, almost no one talks about the anonymous hands that lifted every stone, cooked every meal, and carried the weight of an entire empire. And the most curious, or perhaps disturbing thing, is that without them, Rome simply wouldn't exist. It may sound strange, even counterintuitive, but the more slaves a family owned, the more prestige it enjoyed. In other words, the dignity of some was measured by the servitude of others. And herein lies the controversy. Could it be that today, in the 21st century, we are experiencing modern versions of this, only disguised as more subtle forms of exploitation? This is the kind of uncomfortable truth that almost no one tells, because behind the pomp of the banquets, the glitter of the statues, and the glory of the arenas, there was sweat, pain, and a tedious routine. And it is precisely this routine that we will delve into now. The hidden details, the clanking of the chains, the smell of the simple food, the glances that never made it into history. And I want you to be part of this conversation with me. Before we begin, comment below, where are you watching from and what time is it? It's curious to see how, even separated by time and space, we can connect over stories that span centuries. The history of slaves in Rome begins in places that to many seem distant, but which actually carry echoes of our daily lives. Imagine someone being torn from their homeland after a war and suddenly waking up in a strange city with an unfamiliar language, unfamiliar smells of spices and smoke, and even the sound of Latin echoing in noisy market. Unbeknownst to them, they were now a cog in the machine that sustained the empire. This forced origin shaped the lives of thousands of people whose stories were rarely told. It wasn't just war that created new slaves. Debt also weighed like invisible chain. Many free men, unable to pay what they owed, found themselves forced to surrender their freedom. It's like thinking today about someone who loses their home because they couldn't pay their mortgage, only instead of losing the property, they lost themselves. This detail shows that slavery was not only a result of battles, but also of a ruthless economic system that offered no mercy to those who failed. And then there was trade. In Rome, slaves were bought and sold like animals in bustling markets, where everything from physical strength to appearance was evaluated. The buyer would walk in circles, examining teeth, muscles, and even scars, much like someone today might look at a used car before closing a deal. The merchandise breathed, trembled, and knew that its life would henceforth depend on the will of a stranger. This banality of buying a person reveals how little value human life had. We cannot forget those who were already born into this reality. Children, daughters of slaves, had no choice. They were automatically the property of their master. From their first cry, they were destined to serve. Today, when we think of a baby, we think of hope, future, possibilities. But for them, each cry was like a silent sentence. It's a stark reflection. While some children in Rome were wrapped in thin sheets, others grew up in damp barracks without the right to even dream of freedom. Scenario, though ancient, resonates today. Just think about how we're often trapped in situations we didn't choose. Jobs that drain energy, debts that seem endless, hostile environments that impose limits. The difference is that today we can still seek solutions to study, to start a business, to move to another city. In Rome, the way out rarely came from the slave's own hands. It was always a favor, a decision made by someone else, almost like a winning ticket in a cruel lottery. The origins of Roman slaves, therefore, were a mixture of war, poverty, trade, and birth. Each of these paths led to the same destination, the loss of freedom, and although the routes were different, they all ended at the same starting point of a life of service. But what was truly intriguing was what happened after this origin, the roles these men and women performed daily, roles that sustained Rome in an almost invisible, yet absolutely indispensable way. In Rome's slave markets, the atmosphere was noisy and dense, filled with voices mingling with the smell of sweat, spices, and dust, stirred up by the coming and going of the crowd. Amidst this scene, men, women, and children were displayed like merchandise, lined up in busy squares, waiting for the moment when a bidding process would decide their fate. The contrast was stark. For some, this was a space for business opportunity. For others, it was the end of what they called a free life. Public auctions followed an almost theatrical logic. The seller extolled the slave's qualities as if he were a luxury product. Tough, healthy, fit for hard work, he would say, while someone examined the unfortunate man's teeth, muscles, and even the sparkle in his eyes. It's curious to think that today we do something similar when searching for product reviews online, except that back then the object breathed, felt fear, and knew it was being judged. This trivialization of human life shows how far removed the Roman mentality was from ours. There were also private sales, less noisy but equally cold. Wealthy gentlemen negotiated in their own homes, receiving merchants who brought slaves as if they were exclusive commodities. It was almost like buying a rare jewel or a piece of art, except that the art spoke, walked, and carried a story of pain. This silent trade reinforced the idea that power needed no stage. Money was enough, and everything was resolved behind closed doors. For the slave, every detail of these moments was fraught with tension. His heart raced when someone approached. The buyer's gaze weighed like a chain, and uncertainty eroded any hope. It was impossible not to imagine what lay ahead: work in the fields, domestic service, or perhaps the dreaded life in the mines. The cruel lottery was not in his hands, but in the voice of those with gold coins to offer. It's as if today a job interview could decide not only his salary, but his entire existence. This market shaped not only the economy, but also the culture of Rome. Buying people was so common that no one questioned the practice. It was part of everyday life, like buying bread at the bakery. This naturalization of the absurd makes us wonder how many things we consider normal today that centuries from now might be seen as cruel. It invites us to reflect on modern habits, such as excessive consumption or the exploitation of cheap labor in distant factories. Thus, the slave market was more than a space for transactions. It was a theater of inequality, where the fates of thousands were sealed amid applause and the clinking of coins. But the true story of these slaves' lives began after the sale. In the day-to-day activities they performed, activities that went far beyond what we can imagine today. When a slave arrived at his destination, the first decision about his life was simple but brutal. What kind of work would he be assigned? Each role had its own weight, rhythm, and sentence. Some were assigned to domestic service, where they spent their days polishing furniture, cooking, cleaning, and caring for children. Others were sent to the fields, where the sun burned mercilessly, and their bodies had to perform from sunrise to sunset. Each choice was less about skill and more about the master's need. In the domestic environment, a curious paradox existed. The slave lived closely with the Roman family, participated in meals as a servant, heard secrets, and witnessed joys and disagreements. In a way, he was like that employee who knew more about his boss's life than his own best friend. Yet this closeness did not imply respect. It was simply a different form of servitude. The finest garments in the house passed through the hands of these slaves, but they never clothed their bodies. Back in the countryside, the reality was much harsher. The large estates demanded brute strength, endurance, and near-blind obedience. Work began with the first ray of sunlight and only ended when night fell. Sweat mixed with the earth, and the routine seemed endless. Today, when someone complains about the burden of an 8-hour shift in front of a computer, they perhaps can't imagine what it was like to wield a hoe for 16 hours in intense heat without the right to a proper rest. Artisans formed another interesting group. Some slaves had specific talents. They knew how to work with wood, metals, and ceramics. They were assigned to workshops where they produced useful objects or even refined pieces that decorated luxurious homes. The irony was clear. They created beauty for others, but lived in uncomfortable environments. This is similar to the reality of many creative professionals today who design dreams for clients while struggling to pay their own bill. There were also those thrown into the mines, perhaps the cruelest fate of all. The air was heavy, the space stifling, and death lurked with every excavation. Few survived long, and there was no glamour in such work. It was a sentence of exhaustion, almost as if the empire were sucking the last drop of life from those bodies. In comparison, it's like the ancient version of modern sweatshops, only without any laws to protect them. And of course, there were the gladiators and educators, two curious extremes. A slave could become a life or death spectacle before crowds, or he could teach the children of senators about philosophy and literature. The same system that reduced a person to an object could also use them as a source of entertainment or knowledge. This variety of roles shows how Rome squeezed every ounce of usefulness from the lives of its slaves. And yet each path was only the beginning of a long routine of survival, which would soon reveal itself in even deeper detail. In the vast Roman estates called Villa Rustica, the agricultural routine was like a never-stop machine. The slave's day began even before sunrise, when dew still coated the leaves, and the air carried the damp scent of dawn. They were awakened by the overseer and immediately had tools in hand. The morning silence was soon replaced by the sound of hoes hitting the earth, oxen dragging plows, and shouts of supervision echoing across the fields. Life there was marked by the rhythm of nature. Spring required sowing, summer called for irrigation and harvesting, autumn for storing reserves, and winter, though calmer, brought maintenance work. Each season imposed its burden without breaks, without rights, without long pauses. It's curious to think about this when today we complain about the changing seasons, too hot, too cold, without realizing that for them, each change represented a challenge to survival. The latifundium was also a space of contrast. On one side, the manor house, spacious and ornate, where the owners enjoyed hearty meals and conversations around the fireplace. On the other, the slaves' quarters, often simple barracks, lacking privacy, without proper beds, just straw on the floor. It was as if two worlds coexisted, separated by a few meters, but by an unbridgeable chasm, and this chasm revealed itself every day in the food, the clothing, and even the tone of voice each person might use. Agricultural tasks were diverse: planting wheat, harvesting grapes for wine, tending olive trees, feeding animals. Each task required skill, endurance, and obedience. It's interesting to imagine how even the wine served at aristocratic banquets came from the calloused hands of anonymous slaves who would never taste the same quality of the product they produced. Today, when we open a bottle of wine, We rarely think about who planted the grapes. Back then, it was a silent reminder of everyday inequality. Despite the harsh conditions, some agricultural slaves eventually developed specific skills, such as planting and harvesting techniques, that made them valuable to their masters. But this value didn't translate into personal benefits. It simply ensured they would be less discarded. They were as if they were human tools, preserved only as long as they were useful. It's an uncomfortable reflection to what extent, even today, are we valued solely for the usefulness we provide at work and not for who we truly are. Thus, agricultural labor on Roman latifundia was more than just sweating the soil. It was the foundation of the economy and at the same time a reflection of inequality. And although this scenario already seems fraught, there was another world within Rome where slaves played distinct roles: the domestic sphere, where the master's luxury was sustained by the invisible details of everyday life. Inside the wealthiest Roman homes, the lives of domestic slaves had a very different rhythm from those who worked in the fields, but no less exhausting. The day began in the dark when the silence was broken by the clanging of pots and pans, hurried footsteps, and whispered orders in the hallways. Each had a well-defined role: cooks preparing the first meal, nurses tending to crying children, caretakers tidying the home, and servants polishing objects that would shine under the gaze of guests. The cook, for example, carried an enormous responsibility. It wasn't just about putting food on the table, it was about creating dishes that would impress important guests, blending spices and aromas brought from different corners of the empire. Imagine someone preparing a Roman banquet with honey, oriental spices, and fresh wine, while the cook himself barely tasted what he cooked. It was like being the main performer in a show without ever being able to see the play itself. Nurses, on the other hand, occupied a curious space of forced intimacy. They often cared for Roman children more than their own mothers, rocking them in their arms, feeding them, telling stories, and even being the first figure of affection the little ones recognized. However, all it took was a single mistake, a prolonged cry, any carelessness for them to be punished mercilessly. This duality is reminiscent of many nannies or caregivers today who dedicate genuine affection to children who are not their own, yet always live on the fringes of the family. The caretakers and servants were like silent shadows, always present but never noticed. They dusted, organized objects, carried water, and took care of small invisible tasks that made the home seem naturally ordered. If everything was spotless, no one mentioned them, but if something went wrong, they were sternly reminded. It's almost like the feeling of invisible work behind the scenes. When it works, no one notices. When it fails, everyone points it out. The curious thing is that despite living in luxury, these slaves didn't enjoy it. They slept in makeshift quarters, ate leftovers, and only had access to the beauty of the home through work. It's as if someone worked in a designer clothing store, arranging elegant window displays, but only had simple worn clothes to wear. This contradiction marked every moment of domestic life, being surrounded by comfort, but never truly belonging to it. Thus, the domestic environment might seem less brutal than the fields, but it concealed constant psychological pressure. The slave was always under surveillance, always available, always at the mercy of unexpected order. And it was in this context that even more specialized figures emerged. Those who, in addition to serving, possessed technical and intellectual talents, the so-called specialized slaves. Among Roman slaves, there were those who went far beyond manual labor. They were men and women with rare intellectual or technical abilities, used as accountants, secretaries, and even doctors. Interestingly, many of these slaves came from regions of Greece or the East, places renowned for their knowledge. The Roman master knew that having a slave capable of organizing finances or caring for the family's health was a true treasure, and this even influenced the way they were treated. The accountant, for example, was responsible for handling the numbers, records, and accounts of the household or estate.
In an era without calculators or spreadsheets, everything was done with wax tablets, papyrus, and memorize. Imagine the pressure. An error in the records could mean loss or distrust from the Lord. It was like being the human Excel of antiquity. And although they had closer ties to the owner, they were always reminded that their freedom had an owner. The secretary, on the other hand, assumed the role of his master's intellectual shadow. He wrote letters, copied documents, took notes in meetings, and often had access to confidential information. He knew political secrets, family intrigues, and even business plans, but could not use them to his own advantage. It's ironic, he held valuable knowledge, but no power whatsoever. It's like the assistant who knows more about the company than the director himself, but will never be invited to sit in the top chair. Among the specialists, doctors held a special place. Many were Greek, trained in schools that blended philosophy, anatomy, and rudimentary healing practice. They cared not only for their masters, but also for their slaves, applying ointments, herbs, and performing minor surgeries. However, even though they were respected physicians within their households, they remained without freedom. Imagine a man capable of saving lives, but incapable of deciding the course of his own. This contradiction was painful. These skilled slaves also experienced a kind of social ambiguity. They were treated with a certain respect, and in some cases, even received small rewards, but they could never forget their status. It was like constantly teetering on the edge between being useful and being disposable. Today, we can draw a parallel with professionals who are indispensable in companies but remain undervalued, living under fragile contracts or low wages. Usefulness does not guarantee dignity. Therefore, these specialized slaves demonstrate how Rome knew how to extract every last human talent, not just physical strength. They were proof that knowledge, though powerful, could be captured and used for the benefit of a few. And while some organized accounts or wrote speeches, there were also those who lived by the sweat of the streets, in direct contact with the city, the urban slaves. On the bustling streets of Rome, urban slaves mingled with the throngs of merchants, travelers, and citizens. Their work was noisy, marked by the sound of cartwheels, hammers banging in workshops, and the shouts of vendors offering their wares. Unlike slaves in the fields or in wealthy households, these slaves lived in constant motion, rushing from one place to another, carrying goods, delivering errands, or helping with small businesses. They were the invisible cogs that kept the city running at its frenetic pace. Slave vendors were common sights in markets. Many offered their masters' products: olive oil, wine, fabrics, spices. Others were responsible for managing entire stalls, negotiating prices, and dealing with customers as if they were free traders, but of course, without ever keeping the profits. It's like imagining someone running a modern store, taking care of every detail, but without a salary at the end of the month. This paradox demonstrated how even the talent for negotiation was used for the benefit of others. Porters lived by brute force. They dragged amphorae filled with wine, building stones, or even heavy furniture over long distances. These men's bodies were their primary tools, and every muscle worked to exhaustion. When we think of trucks, forklifts, or elevators today, it's clear how much technology has replaced these functions. But back then, the load was always supported by human shoulders, and the shoulders of slaves were the first choice. Manual laborers, on the other hand, performed a wide variety of tasks: repairing streets, cleaning aqueducts, and unloading ships at the port. It was repetitive, monotonous, and often invisible work, but absolutely necessary for the city. It's interesting to consider how, even in modern societies, there are still invisible roles that sustain collective life, such as street cleaners, janitors, and maintenance workers. Without them, apparent order collapses, and yet they receive little recognition. The routine of these urban slaves was exhausting, but it also revealed something curious. They were constantly in contact with the pulsating life of the city. Unlike those who lived isolated in the fields or imprisoned in mansions, they experienced daily life in Rome up close, overheard conversations, witnessed spectacles, and breathed in the mingled smells of food, sweat, and smoke that characterized the streets. This proximity kept them alert, but also broadened their horizons. Therefore, urban slaves were a kind of reflection of the city, dynamic, diverse, indispensable. They didn't live in silence like agricultural workers, nor in luxury like domestic workers. They lived in the hustle and bustle, in noise, in the sweat shared with everyone around them. And yet, even they could be deployed to even greater projects, which would leave physical marks on the history of Rome, the construction of roads, aqueducts, and temples. When we talk about the great Roman works, roads that crisscrossed the empire, aqueducts that carried water miles away, majestic temples that defied time, we rarely remember those who placed stone upon stone. The truth is that behind every column and arch lay the strength of slaves who transformed sweat and pain into monuments. While citizens admired the grandeur, these anonymous workers lived buried under the literal weight of the construction. Road work was endless. Slaves spent days carrying heavy stones, leveling the ground with simple tools, and compacting the earth. The goal was to create roads solid enough to support entire armies. Imagine the scene: miles of stones fitted by hand under the scorching sun, with no real pause for rest. Today, a road can be built by machines in months. In ancient Rome, it was built with hunched backs and calloused hands. With aqueducts, the challenge was even greater. These canals, responsible for bringing clean water to cities, required precise slope calculations and kilometers of excavation. Slaves dug tunnels, carried stones, and adjusted giant blocks that needed to fit perfectly. The risk of collapse was constant, and many never emerged alive from these stone corridors. It's curious to think that when we turn on a tap today, we rarely remember the human effort that created such basic water supply systems. Temples, on the other hand, were the most visible face of Rome's devotion and power. Every architectural detail, every immense column, every sculpture was the result of endless hours of slave labor. Some had heavier tasks, carrying blocks of marble, others with specialized skills, carved and decorated. But in the end, everyone contributed to building spaces where they would never be invited to pray as citizens. It was the cruel contrast between creating the sacred and remaining in the profane realm of servitude. The environment of these construction sites was marked by incessant noise, echoing hammers, creaking ropes, supervisors shouting for speed. The smell of dust mingled with sweat, and the feeling was of an eternal construction site. For the slave, each day seemed the same as the last, an endless sequence of physical exertion and constant surveillance. It was a work that, besides destroying bodies, erased identities, transforming men into mere cogs in a monumental mechanism. Thus, the slaves who built public and private works not only sustained the empire with their strength, but also left invisible marks on history. Their names were not engraved in stone, but their efforts shaped the landscape of Rome. And while these works impressed the eyes of the citizen, there were other places where slavery impressed no one: deep, dark, and deadly mines, where hope rarely blossomed. If life in the fields was already harsh and public works exhausting, in the mines, the situation reached the limit of inhumanity. There, the air was heavy, the heat stifling, and the darkness perpetual. Slaves were forced down narrow tunnels, barely large enough for one person, equipped with rudimentary tools like pickaxes and leather basket. The sound was always the same, iron clanging against stone, muffled groans and curt orders from the overseers supervising from above. Working in gold, silver, or copper mines meant a short life. The humidity corroded the lungs, the dust undermined breathing, and the risk of cave-ins was daily.
Many didn't last more than a few months.
Compared to today, it would be like working in a toxic factory without masks, equipment, or breaks, except that in the Roman era, there were no unions, rights, or compensation, just silence in the face of death. A slave who fell was replaced the same day. The underground environment was filled with strong odors, sulfur, sweat, and a mixture of wet earth and blood. There was no natural light, only torches, which consumed oxygen and made the air even worse. The shifts were long and without set schedules. The notion of time was lost, and many left the mine without knowing whether it was day or night. It was a prison without bars, where darkness itself was the cell. The hands of these slaves were always wounded and calloused, and their emaciated bodies reflected the scarcity of food. Food was minimal, barely enough to keep them alive until the next shift. Some tried to resist, hiding small nuggets or fragments of metal as a form of secret hope, but if discovered, they were severely punished. The wealth that sustained the empire was born from the invisible suffering of these men. It's shocking to think that marble temples, gleaming coins, and the jewels of powerful families had their origins in this labor of death. The glitter of Roman riches actually reflected the erasure of the lives of thousands of anonymous slaves. Today, when we see a jewel or a luxury object, we rarely think about the human cost behind the raw material, but back then that cost was explicit, cruel, and inevitable. The mines were therefore the most feared. For a Roman slave, hearing that he would be sent there was almost like receiving a death sentence. And while life was fading away in the depths of the earth, above ground in their collective quarters, the reality was no less harsh. The dormitories and resting spaces revealed another side of slave living conditions. When night fell in Rome or in the countryside, slaves did not return to a home, but to a communal space, often precarious.
The walls of these spaces rarely offered comfort. They were damp, poorly constructed, and let in the cold in winter and the stifling heat in summer. The smell was of smoke, sweat, and often spoiled food. It was an environment where disease spread easily, as the close proximity of bodies and the lack of hygiene created perfect conditions for epidemics. The barracks were both a temporary refuge and an invisible prison. There were no beds, pillows, or sheets. Most slept on straw, sometimes even on stones, wrapped in rough cloth if they were lucky. Today, when we complain about an uncomfortable mattress or a bad night's sleep, it's hard to imagine what it would be like to live for years without knowing what it was like to lie down on something soft. The slave's rest was never complete. Their bodies remained aching and their minds alert, waiting for the next call. In the larger barracks, forced coexistence created tensions. There were arguments over space, food, and any small comforts that could be shared. At the same time, bonds of solidarity emerged, with companions in misfortune sharing stories or soft songs to ease the hardship. This mixture of conflict and affection was part of everyday life, reminiscent of today's overcrowded environments, such as shelters, prisons, or precarious dormitories and sweatshops. Some domestic slaves had slightly better conditions, sleeping in tiny rooms within the manor houses. Even so, these were makeshift spaces, devoid of luxury and proper furniture. Proximity to their masters didn't mean comfort, only constant surveillance. It was like living in the hallway of a grand mansion, surrounded by beauty, but never truly touching it. These living spaces, so far removed from the idea of home, were merely the backdrop to the slaves' exhausting lives. And even in these hostile environments, there was something that constantly reminded them of their condition. The food they received, so scarce and unequal that it accurately reflected their place in the Roman hierarchy. The diet of Roman slaves was simple, repetitive, and almost always insufficient. Most days, it consisted of coarse bread made with low-quality flour mixed with impurities to make it last longer. The flavor was dry and heavy, and often stale before the day was even over. Alongside this came a cereal porridge, cooked in water or, if lucky, in a thin broth. It was a food designed solely to keep the body functioning, not to provide pleasure. Legumes appeared sporadically, grains, lentils, and broad beans. They were cooked in large communal pots, served without any fancy seasoning. The smell was always the same, a mixture of bland stew and campfire smoke. For many, that aroma became synonymous with survival. Today, when we choose from dozens of options in a supermarket, it's hard to imagine living life eating almost the same 3 or 4 things with no variety or freshness. Meat was rare, almost non-existent in the slave's diet. When it did appear, it came in small portions, usually bones or less noble pieces, leftovers from the master's meals. It was the kind of food that arrived more as an exception than the rule. For them, the taste of meat was almost a distant memory, an unattainable luxury. It's as if someone today only tasted chocolate once a year, not by choice, but by condition. This scarcity left visible marks on the body. Slaves were thin, frail, with signs of malnutrition in their hair, teeth, and skin. Their bodies were overworked but underfueled. It's a cruel parallel to modern workers who spend long hours eating fast food, cheap food just to keep up. The difference is that in Rome, not even the option of choosing what little existed. Despite its simplicity, food also had a psychological role. It was a time when everyone came together, even in silence, to share what little they had. A few quiet songs or stories might emerge in these moments, transforming that tasteless dish into a rare moment of community. Even in scarcity, bonds were being forged. This sharing, however modest, served as a reminder of humanity. Thus, the diet of Roman slaves not only nourished the body, or rather barely nourished it, but also reinforced social inequality. While their masters feasted on wine, meat, and desserts, the slaves survived on stale bread and bland porridge. And if their food already demonstrated their place in the hierarchy, the treatment they received in their daily routine made this even more evident. The treatment of slaves in Rome was not uniform, but ranged from extreme to extreme. Some masters exercised daily cruelty, physical punishment, public humiliation, and suffocating surveillance. Others, however, adopted an almost paternalistic stance, viewing their slaves as part of the extended family, though they never failed to remind them of their property status. This contrast created an atmosphere of uncertainty. One never knew whether the day would bring punishment or tolerance. In the most severe cases, the master treated the slave as a disposable tool. If one broke, it was replaced. Cruelty was seen as a method of discipline, and whips, chains, and branding were common instruments. Imagine living on constant alert, as if any mistake, spilling wine, speaking out of turn, could result in immediate physical pain. This climate of fear eroded even the most intimate hope of dignity. In other homes, however, the relationship was ambiguous. Some masters offered better food, small privileges, and even trust in certain tasks. The slave became a sort of right-hand man, someone close enough to be useful but never free enough to forget the hierarchy. It's similar to modern employers who treat their employees like family, but at the end of the month, the relationship is defined by the payroll. This variation in treatment also depended on the role performed. Domestic slaves, especially skilled ones, were given more consideration, while field and mine workers were treated with brutal coldness. It was as if there were an invisible scale of human worth, determined not by character or feelings but by economic usefulness. And the less useful a person was considered, the more merciless life became. Interestingly, some masters believed that treating slaves better increased their loyalty. They offered better clothing, opportunities to learn a skill, or even small rewards. But this wasn't genuine kindness, it was simply strategy. The ultimate goal was always the same: to extract maximum labor. The slave was never seen as an equal, only as an investment. This logic persists in many modern environments, where benefits exist, but only to maintain productivity. Thus, treatment varied, but the essence remained. Slaves were property, not full persons. Some lived in constant fear, others in a bubble of false closeness, and regardless of the tone of the relationship, there was always someone ensuring that orders were carried out: the supervisors, central figures in the control of slave life. On Roman estates, the figure of the foreman, called a villicus, was central to the lives of slaves. He was the intermediary between the master and the workers, responsible for monitoring, organizing tasks, and punishing those who failed to follow orders. The day began under his stern watch, with lists of tasks distributed and immediate demand. For the slaves, it was like living under the constant shadow of someone who represented both power and threat. The overseer was often chosen from among the slaves themselves, usually someone considered more trustworthy, more experienced, or simply tough. This created an ambiguous situation. He was a slave too, but he held authority over the others. This position generated resentment and, at the same time, fear. It was like a coworker promoted to supervisor, but without true freedom, just more responsibility and the burden of being hated. Punishments were always at his disposal: whips, food restrictions, isolation. The villicus enforced the discipline his master demanded, ensuring that every grain was planted, every harvest harvested on time. His figure reminded them that obedience was not optional. His mere presence in the fields, walking with firm steps, was enough to keep the bodies moving. He was the living embodiment of control. Despite his role, the foreman also lived a paradox. He might receive better clothes, less substandard food, and even a separate room, but his freedom remained imprisoned. It was as if he wore a golden collar, shiny on the outside, but a collar nonetheless. Many of them knew that any mistake could result in their loss of their position and a return to hard labor. This hierarchy imposed by the overseers created divisions among the slaves themselves. Some saw the villicus as a traitor, others as someone to fear, and a few as an ally. The already hostile environment in the camps was made even more tense by this layer of distrust. Instead of unity, the system encouraged competition, preventing more organized collective resistance. Thus, the foreman's presence shaped not only the pace of work, but also human relationships within the latifundium. He was the guardian of discipline, the bridge between orders and obedience, and the constant reminder that the slave's life was always under surveillance. If men were controlled in this way, women lived yet another reality, one that mixed domestic labor, care, and vulnerability before their masters. The lives of female slaves in Rome carried a double burden of oppression. Not only did they work intensely,
but they were also constantly vulnerable to abuse. Their responsibilities ranged from the heaviest domestic tasks to intimate care for children and the elderly. In the silence of the early morning, they were the first to wake to light the fire, prepare food, organize clothes, and ensure the house was ready before their masters even awoke. It was an invisible routine, but essential to the functioning of the home. Many of these women served as wet nurses, caring for their masters' children. They fed babies, rocked them to sleep, and became central figures in their childhoods. The curious and painful thing is that they were often separated from their own children to take on this role. Imagine the paradox: nurturing and loving a child that wasn't yours, while your own grew up far away without a mother's care. This kind of sacrifice was common and considered natural in that society. In household chores, they did everything: washing clothes in icy streams, sewing fabrics until nightfall, cleaning marble floors that would shine at banquets. The work was never done, and vigilance was constant. The sound of hands scrubbing, water running into clay basins, and brooms dragging across the floor marked the rhythm of their hours. There was no true rest, only short pauses before the next order. But the cruelest aspect of the lives of female slaves was their sexual vulnerability. Many were viewed as property not only for their work but also for their owner's pleasure. This was no exception, it was common practice. With no right to refuse, no voice, they were forced to endure the silence of submission.
Today, when we speak of gender-based violence, it's impossible not to draw a parallel with this ancient reality where enslaved women didn't even have the right to denounce or resist. Some, in rare cases, achieved a measure of protection if they gained the trust of the lady of the house. But even this protection was fragile, dependent on the family's mood or interests. The fate of female slaves was always out of their hands, conditioned by the desires and will of their owner. Dignity, when it existed, was an unstable luxury. Thus, the daily lives of female slaves were made up of endless journeys, care from others, and silent abuse. They supported their households in silence, even when they bore visible and invisible. And if their lives within the home were marked by this cycle of work and submission, outside it, some were forced into even more public and dangerous roles, as in the world of Roman entertainment. In the heart of Rome, entertainment was more than just fun. It was spectacle, politics, and power. And within this landscape, many slaves became gladiators or actors, living pieces in a game that didn't belong to them. At sunrise, gladiators trained amid the metallic clang of swords, the smell of sweat and blood mingling with the dust of the arena. They weren't warriors by choice, but prisoners transformed into a spectacle to please the crowd. Gladiators lived in training schools, called ludi, where discipline was strict. They received better food than most slaves, as they needed to be strong, but in exchange they risked their own bodies. With each fight, the tension was palpable. The audience cheered with every blow, while the slave gladiator knew that his life depended not only on his skill, but also on the will of the audience and the emperor. It was like being an athlete and a hostage at the same time. Interestingly, some gladiators achieved fame and even popular admiration. They received applause, had followers, and in rare cases could buy their own freedom. However, this glory was fragile, built on blood and fear. Imagine today an idolized soccer player, but knowing that every match could kill him on the field. This was the reality for these men, heroes in the eyes of the crowd, slaves within themselves. Slave actors, on the other hand, faced a less deadly fate. but one equally marked by exploitation. They performed in plays, often satirical, that entertained the population. They had to memorize lines, portray emotions, and elicit laughter, but were constantly reminded that they were nothing more than property. The irony was stark. They played kings and gods on stage, but off stage, they returned to lives of servitude. The contrast between gladiators and actors reveals how Rome used the image of slaves at different levels of spectacle. Some were exposed to death, others to laughter, but both served the same purpose: to entertain, distract, and reinforce the power of the elite. The audience didn't see people, they saw characters' bodies offered to satisfy collective expectations. Entertainment was, in essence, just another facet of slavery. And if on stage or in the arena the slave was displayed to the public, outside of these spaces, there was yet another type of exposure, much more painful: the physical marking that transformed bodies into identifiable objects without the right to anonymity. In Rome, slavery wasn't just about chains or surveillance, but also about physical markings. Many slaves were tattooed or branded, as if they were animals or commodities. These marks served as visible certificates of ownership, a constant reminder that they didn't belong to themselves. Skin, which should have been a space of personal identity, became a parchment of submission. The most common tattoos bore simple inscriptions: the owner's name, instructions for return in case of escape, or symbols identifying their function. It was as if the body were reduced to a walking document. Imagine walking down the street with a phrase on your forehead or arm that read, "I belong to so-and-so." It's a level of dehumanization so profound that even your skin ceased to be a space of privacy. The red-hot iron was even more cruel. It burned the flesh, leaving scars that never faded. The smell of burning skin mixed with the slave's stifled scream, creating memories impossible to erase. For the masters, it was merely a guarantee of ownership. For those who received the brand, it was a sentence tattooed forever. Today, when we talk about visual identity, we think of clothing, haircuts, styles for them. Identity was imposed with pain. These marks also functioned as a psychological mechanism. The slave didn't need constant chains, as they carried on their body a reminder of their condition. Even among other slaves, these scars created differences. Some were seen as more valuable, others as more punished. The body became a kind of involuntary calling card, showing everyone where they came from and to whom they belonged. There's a curious parallel with the modern world. Today, many choose tattoos to express freedom, art, or personal stories. In slave-owning Rome, the same device was used as a form of imprisonment. The difference lies precisely in the choice. When it comes from freedom, the mark is identity. When imposed, it's imprisoned. This inversion makes us reflect on how symbols can have opposite meanings, depending on the context. Thus, marks and tattoos were more than just external signs. They were wounds that transformed the body into a document and living reminder of submission. And if this marking served as control, the next step was discipline. Punishments that daily reinforced the slave's place within the Roman hierarchy. Discipline among Roman slaves was maintained through feet. Corporal punishment was the most common method, applied as a form of control and example. The sound of the whip cracking through the air became familiar in the fields and homes, and each blow left scars not only on the body but also on the mind. A simple mistake, knocking over a jar, falling behind on a task, could result in immediate pain. For the masters, it was education. For the slaves, it was daily terror. Chains were another symbol of discipline. Runaway slaves, or those considered rebellious, had their hands and feet bound with heavy irons, limiting their movement.
They slept in chains, worked dragging heavy loads, and lived as if they were part of a rusty machine. The metallic sound of the chains became the soundtrack of their life. Imagine walking around all day with iron anklets, unable to run, sit, or lie down in peace. Beyond everyday punishments, there were exemplary ones. In cases of greater rebellion, crucifixion was used as a form of public intimidation. Bodies were displayed on roads and in squares for all to see the fate of those who dared defy order. The suffering was prolonged and the message was clear. Freedom was not permitted. It is shocking to realize how the same practice made famous in Christian history was a common tool of discipline against slaves. The psychological effect of these punishments was devastating. The slave didn't need to be punished every day to feel fear. It was enough to see or hear others suffering. Terror spread throughout the collective, maintaining obedience by anticipation. It's similar to modern environments where the fear of being fired, humiliated, or excluded is enough to keep people in line even without direct punishment. Some masters, for convenience's sake, alternated harshness with reward. They meted out harsh punishments when necessary but offered small perks to keep the most obedient. It was a game of manipulation, beating with one hand and feeding with the other. This dynamic bound slaves not only with chains but with confusing expectations, keeping them perpetually insecure. Thus, discipline in Rome was not only physical but also psychological, a cycle of fear and submission. And if punishments reduced life to pain and survival, there was another factor that made slave existence so fragile: low life expectancy, especially among those assigned to the most demanding role. The life of a slave in Rome was short, especially for those who performed heavy labor, such as in the mines or fields. Their bodies were wasted day after day, and they rarely reached old age. Life expectancy was so low that many masters viewed their slaves as temporary resources, expecting to need to replace them within a few years. It was a cruel cycle where human life was reduced to the durability of a tool. The physical strain was brutal: endless working hours, exposure to the sun, cold or unsanitary environments. Poor nutrition and lack of medical care quickly sapped stamina. While a Roman citizen could expect to live for decades, many slaves barely reached. It was as if every hour of work cost not just energy but entire days of life. The body aged prematurely, marked by constant pain and never healed wounds. The mines in particular were living cemeteries. Those who entered rarely emerged healthy. The dust, humidity, and lack of air destroyed the lungs, and cave-ins claimed lives in seconds. In the fields, accidents with animals, tools, and extreme exertion also claimed many lives prematurely. Death was not a surprise, but rather routine. For the masters, the loss of a slave was merely an economic loss, quickly resolved by purchasing another. This scenario shows how time held a different weight for slaves. Each dawn didn't mean hope, but another day of wear and tear. Imagine living knowing you'd hardly grow old. That old age was a distant privilege. Today, when we think about retirement plans or enjoying old age, it's almost impossible not to reflect on how, for them, life was all about surviving the next. Even among those who performed less demanding tasks, such as domestic or specialized work, life expectancy was still lower than that of free citizens. Disease, abuse, and constant stress eroded any possibility of full longevity. The difference lay only in the speed at which life was consumed. It was like comparing a candle lit in a strong wind with one protected indoors. Both burn out, but one goes out much sooner. Thus, low life expectancy was not a coincidence, but an inevitable consequence of the system. Slaves were seen as replaceable, and this defined every aspect of their daily lives. But amid this cycle of premature death, there was a spark of hope that kept some people going: the possibility of manumission, the chance to one day achieve freedom amidst all the shadows of slave life in Rome. The idea of manumission was like a distant ray of light. Manumission represented the possibility, however remote, of gaining freedom. For some, it came as a reward after years of faithful service. For others, it could be purchased with savings accumulated through extra work authorized by the master. It was a rare opportunity, but enough to fuel dreams and keep hopes alive amid the daily hardships. Manumission could occur in various forms. There were public ceremonies before authorities where the master officially declared that the slave no longer belonged to him. Other times it was a private act, recorded in documents. In both cases, the impact was immense. From property, the slave became a limited citizen, a libertus, still bound by certain obligations, but with a recognized identity of his own. It was like walking through a door into a nearly inaccessible world. For many, this freedom came after long years of domestic service, when the slave earned the master's trust. Others achieved it thanks to rare skills, such as doctors or highly valued artisans. There were still those who saved small sums, working permitted overtime, until they accumulated enough to buy their own freedom. Imagine the discipline required, secretly saving coins for decades, just to dream of independence. But manumission also had its limitations. The libertus carried the weight of eternal gratitude to the former master, who became his patron. There were obligations of loyalty, occasional services, and even social restrictions. It was a freedom with conditions, an invisible tether that constantly reminded him of where he had come from. It was like leaving prison, but still wearing a symbolic electronic ankle bracelet. Still, this possibility transformed mindsets. The mere knowledge that manumission existed encouraged some to obey, to work diligently, or to develop their talents. It was a mechanism of control, but also a breath of hope. For slaves, dreaming of freedom could be the force that kept them alive, even when their bodies were already in tatters. Manumission, therefore, represented a glimmer of humanity within an inhumane system, and when achieved, it created a new social category, that of the freed, men and women who bore the scars of slavery, but also began a life marked by new opportunities and challenges. When a Roman slave received manumission, his life changed radically, but not completely. He became a libertus, a freedman, a curious social figure who inhabited the border between servitude and citizenship. He was no longer property, but neither did he enjoy all the rights of a man free from birth. It was as if he always carried an invisible label, former slave.
The freedman maintained obligatory ties with his former master, now called a patron. This bond required loyalty, occasional services, and even financial favors. The relationship could range from respect to exploitation, depending on the patron's character. In many cases, the freedman still lived under the shadow of his past, as if manumission were merely a compromise. It was a limited, monitored freedom, shaped by the expectations of others. Even so, some freedmen prospered. Many became artisans, merchants, and small business owners. Some grew rich and even competed with free citizens in terms of economic influence. It's curious to imagine that, in certain situations, a former slave could have more wealth than ancient Roman families, but socially they would still be remembered as someone who had once belonged to someone else. It was a mark that not even gold could erase. Freedmen also played an important role in cities. They helped energize markets, brought talents acquired during slavery, and contributed to cultural life. Some even entered politics, though without holding positions of greater prestige. They were as if they were invisible cogs that sustained the urban machine, now with greater autonomy, but still within rigid limits. The family life of freedmen was also nuanced. Their children, born free, could rise socially, and in 1 or 2 generations erase the stigma of the past. This prospect of social mobility gave freedmen a sense of purpose. Even if their lives were marked by restrictions,
They planted seeds of a future for their descendants. It was like running a marathon knowing they wouldn't finish, but that someone in their family would cross the finish line. Thus, the freedmen occupied a position of ambiguity, neither slaves nor fully free. They carried scars from the past while simultaneously building bridges to the future. And while most of them lived in cities and wealthy homes, there was one revealing detail. In Rome, almost every wealthy family home had slaves, which further amplified the presence of this reality in everyday life. In Rome, the presence of slaves was a status symbol. The wealthier the family, the more slaves they owned. It was almost unimaginable to enter a wealthy home without seeing servants roaming the hallways, carrying wine jugs, organizing clothes, and preparing meals. The number of slaves served as a social calling card. It demonstrated power, wealth, and influence. It wasn't just about usefulness, but also about prestige. Within these homes, every detail of daily life depended on them, from cleaning the colorful mosaics to tending the gardens. Nothing was done without slave hands. There were those who tended the lamps, those who fed the domestic animals, those who were responsible only for opening and closing the door. This meticulous division of labor reflected not only wealth, but also the desire to exert absolute control over every aspect of life. The curious thing is that for the masters, this scenario was so commonplace that it became invisible. The slave was like part of the furniture, always present, but rarely remembered as a person. It was like today, when many take advantage of delivery or cleaning services without thinking about the people behind them. The difference is that in Rome, there was not even the notion of contract or choice. It was pure property. Visitors, upon entering a house, immediately noticed the number of slaves. They greeted guests at the door, carried cloaks, served drinks, and made a point of reinforcing the owner's image as someone important. It was almost a permanent performance, with the slaves as indispensable extras in a spectacle of power. Their silence or agility was part of the social This constant presence also created a painful contrast. While the masters indulged in banquets laden with wine and spices, the slaves circulated discreetly, sampling only the leftovers. The luxury of some depended on the daily sacrifice of others, and deep down, this inequality was so naturalized that no one questioned it. For the rich, owning slaves wasn't just useful, it was part of what it meant to be Roman. Thus, wealthy households were supported by an invisible crowd, which ensured the appearance of order and grandeur. But the influence of slaves was not limited to private homes. They were also scattered throughout the streets, silently sustaining the city's collective life in roles that rarely received recognition.
On the streets of Rome, slaves were everywhere, but almost never noticed. They swept the streets, carried water in large amphorae, collected trash, and even maintained public spaces. The sound of brooms dragging on the stone floor, the clanking of chains, and the smell of smoke from bonfires blended into the urban routine. It was invisible but essential work, keeping the city running without the free citizens having to think about it. The curious thing is that this invisible service created the illusion of an organized and grand Rome. The aqueducts brought clean water, but slaves ensured their maintenance. The squares were always prepared for meetings and speeches, but slaves swept them after the crowd. Even the simple act of walking down a relatively clean street depended on them. It was like living in a theater where the main actors never appeared on stage. Many of these jobs were repetitive and monotonous, like carrying loads from one point to another or guarding warehouses. Others required more skill, like caring for transport animals or repairing small structures. But in all cases, the logic was the same. If it worked, no one would notice. If it didn't, the blame fell on them. It's similar to modern behind the scenes professionals like lighting technicians or janitors, who are only remembered when something goes wrong. This invisible labor also revealed the city's dependence on slaves. Without them, urban life simply wouldn't function. The baths would be filthy, the streets impassable, the markets disorganized. Rome prided itself on its order and grandeur, but it was silently sustained by a mass of faceless, nameless, and unchosen workers. This invisibility was, paradoxically, proof of its indispensability. For the slaves, this anonymity carried a psychological toll. Living unnoticed, unrecognized, without a recorded name, was like existing in the shadow of a world that only saw free citizens. At the same time, this anonymity gave them a minimal breathing space. They could move around the city, listen to conversations, observe the powerful, without being questioned. It was a partial, if illusory, freedom. Thus, slaves were the invisible cogs that made Rome turn. The city breathed thanks to them, but it didn't recognize their efforts. And in this context, an even more curious type of slave emerged: those who, in addition to serving, also educated, paradoxically shaping the minds of future Roman generations. Among the most surprising roles of slaves in Rome was educating children. Many were Greeks, known for their culture and wisdom, who became pedagogues. The scene was common. While the father took care of business and the mother supervised the household, the slave accompanied the child to school, helped with studies, read aloud, and even corrected behavior. It was he who spent hours with the child, shaping their character and instilling values that would define their adult life. The paradox was evident. A slave with no control over his own life had the power to shape the thinking of future Roman citizens. These educators taught not only reading and writing, but also discipline, rhetoric, and even notions of philosophy. It was as if a prisoner were invited to shape the mindset of a king. The contradiction revealed how much Roman society exploited every available talent, without regard for the fate of the individual. The daily lives of these educators were marked by patience and repetition. They taught Latin declensions, recited poems by Homer, and practiced basic arithmetic. The sound of reading aloud echoed through the courtyards, mingling with the distant noise of the streets. Many boys grew up closer to their slave educators than to their own parents. This closeness engendered respect, but rarely changed the master's social status. Some educators were so respected that they gained a certain influence within the family. Their opinions on discipline or the future of the children were listened to attentively. However, this prestige didn't guarantee them freedom. They remained property, constantly reminded that they were there to serve. It's like a brilliant teacher who develops leaders but never receives credit or recognition for their work. This educational role highlights the complexity of Roman slavery. It wasn't just about brute force, but also about intelligence and culture being exploited. The slave's mind was used as much as their body, and in some cases the impact was so great that a pedagogue's teachings could influence future decisions of Roman leaders. Thus, the education of free citizens was paradoxically supported by invisible chains. And while educators shaped future leaders, there were also slaves who dared to challenge the system itself, rising up against the established order. Among them, one figure would become legendary: Spartacus, leader of the most famous slave revolt. Slavery in Rome seemed an unshakable system, But from time to time, rebellions arose that shook the empire's foundation. The most famous of these was led by Spartacus, a gladiator of Thracian origin, who transformed his personal struggle into a collective symbol. Imprisoned, trained to entertain, he refused to accept his imposed fate and managed to unite thousands of slaves in search of freedom. It was more than a revolt, it was a cry of humanity echoing against the currents. It all began at a gladiator school in the city of Capua. Spartacus, along with other companions, organized a daring escape. Initially armed only with kitchen utensils, they managed to defeat guards and escape. Over time, they accumulated weapons and followers, forming a makeshift army. Imagine the scene. Men who once fought to entertain crowds now marched like determined warriors, transforming desperation into strategy. The revolt grew rapidly. Slaves from different regions and backgrounds joined the movement, drawn by the promise of freedom. With each victory, more men and women joined. Spartacus' army eventually numbered tens of thousands, challenging seasoned Roman troops. It was a painful reminder to the elite. Even those considered voiceless could become a real threat when united. Rome responded with brutal force. Several generals were sent to quell the rebellion, and the fighting dragged on for years. Spartacus demonstrated strategic skill, winning unlikely battles and keeping the dream of freedom alive. But despite his brilliance, the movement was crushed. The end was marked by the crucifixion of thousands of prisoners along the Appian Way, a scene of terror intended to discourage future uprisings. Spartacus' name, however, did not die with him. He became a legend, an inspiration for stories and even modern resistance movements. His revolt showed that no matter how strong the system, there was always room for questioning, for insurgency, for courage. It was like a crack in the seemingly unbreakable marble of Rome. Thus, slave revolts exposed the fragility of an empire built on exploitation. And if these uprisings demonstrated the strength of unity, there was also another unavoidable aspect, the economic impact of slavery, which sustained Rome's expansion and shaped its wealth. The Roman economy was built on the shoulders of slaves. Each military conquest brought thousands of prisoners who became a cheap and abundant labor force. This labor force supported everything from agriculture to mining, including urban and domestic services. Without slaves, Rome would never have achieved the expansion we see in history. They were in practice the silent engine of the empire. On the Latifundia, large-scale agricultural production was only possible because slaves worked tirelessly. Wheat, grapes, olive oil, all the products that supplied entire cities and armies depended on this system. It was as if each harvest was watered not only by water but also by the sweat and blood of thousands. Without this foundation, the soldiers defending the borders would have had nothing to eat, and the cities would have no abundance to display. Trade also thrived under slavery. Slaves operated ports, unloaded ships, and tended warehouses. The riches that circulated across the Mediterranean only reached their destination because there were skilled laborers to carry them. It's like imagining global logistics today without trucks, ships, and planes. It simply wouldn't work. For Rome, slaves were this indispensable and invisible human transportation system. Even urban services, such as the maintenance of aqueducts, roads, and public buildings, depended on slaves. Roman citizens prided themselves on living in a clean, well-stocked, and monumental city, but they rarely acknowledged that this infrastructure was built and maintained by unfree laborers. Rome's greatness, celebrated in speeches and monuments, had a silent basis that was hidden from official narratives.
The economic impact was so profound that even product prices and consumption patterns were tied to slavery. Because labor was abundant and cheap, there was little motivation to invest in production technologies. Rome grew in size and wealth, but remained limited in innovation, precisely because it preferred to exploit human lives rather than create machines. This choice shaped centuries of development and left its mark on the very structure of the empire. Thus, slavery wasn't just an economic detail, it was the central engine of Rome. Each military victory increased the slave pool, and each slave fueled Rome's growth. But within this mechanism lay invisible hierarchies. Not all slaves lived the same reality, and the differences in roles created deep divisions among them. Not all slaves in Rome lived in the same conditions. There was a silent hierarchy among them, determined by the type of work they performed. Domestic workers, for example, despite lacking freedom, had access to better clothing, less precarious food, and less hostile environments. Miners, on the other hand, faced darkness, toxic air, and early death. This difference created a chasm between those who, even as slaves, enjoyed some comfort and those who barely scraped by. Domestic slaves served meals, tended the house, educated children, or cooked banquets. They were surrounded by luxury even if they didn't enjoy it.
It was like living behind the scenes of a show, seeing wealth up close, but never being able to participate in it. Compared to those who worked in mines or fields, they were lucky to suffer less physically. This perception created a kind of quiet pride, almost as if they were a step above within the same prison. Agricultural slaves, and especially miners, suffered the most. Their bodies were used to exhaustion, and life expectancy was minimal. The hierarchy was even reflected in their treatment. While a domestic slave could be punished with restrictions, a miner rarely escaped brutal physical punishment. For many masters, losing a domestic slave was a loss. Losing a miner was merely a statistic. This hierarchy created internal divisions. Those with better conditions often avoided mixing with those who suffered more, creating a psychological barrier. It's like in the modern world, where office workers and factory workers live completely different realities, even though they both support the same system. This division weakened unity and prevented slaves from seeing themselves as a strong collective. On the other hand, there were also moments of solidarity. When punishments were administered in public, everyone shared the fear, regardless of their role. Pain, in these moments, united more than it separated. Still, the feeling that some are luckier than others remained constant, eroding the possibility of widespread organized resistance. Thus, the hierarchy among slaves shows how Rome exploited even inequality within inequality itself. While some were treated as disposable tools, others enjoyed a bit more dignity, but in the end, everyone remained trapped in the same reality. And curiously, there was even a distinct category, public slaves, who belonged not to a master, but to the Roman state itself. In addition to slaves belonging to private families, Rome also had the so-called servi public slave. They served not a specific master, but the state itself, being used for collective tasks. Work such as aqueduct maintenance, temple cleaning, road repairs, and even minor bureaucratic tasks were part of their routine. It was a peculiar category because although they remained slaves, they were directly linked to the state machinery. The daily lives of these men and women varied according to need. Some were assigned to public works, carrying stone and timber for construction. Others worked in archives, copying documents and organizing records. The contrast was stark. While one sweated on construction sites, another spent his days with pens and ink.
immersed in administrative tasks. Yet both carried the same burden, the absence of freedom. Interestingly, the servipublici often had slightly better conditions than the poorest private slaves. Because they served the state, there was a certain amount of care taken to preserve their usefulness. In some cases, they received more stable collective housing, and their food was relatively more secure. This didn't mean real privileges, but it did represent a less precarious life than that of those who toiled in mines or large estates. It was like being an important cog in a machine, not out of respect, but out of necessity. Another striking detail was the visibility of these slaves. While domestic slaves were hidden in wealthy homes and agricultural slaves isolated in the fields, public slaves were always circulating in streets, buildings, and common spaces. This made them a natural part of the urban landscape. They were seen every day but rarely recognized as people. The paradox was that they were indispensable to the city and at the same time invisible to society. Some of these slaves, over time, achieved a degree of autonomy. In some cases, they received small sums for their services, allowing them to save and even dream of freedom. However, this hope was always under the control of the authorities. No amount of accumulated currency changed the fact that they were property of the state. Still, the possibility of amassing resources created a spark of motivation. Thus, the servipublici reveal how Rome exploited not only privately, but also institutionally. Slavery was ingrained in the very functioning of the state, sustaining temples, roads, and and even within this collective structure, a human aspect persisted. Slaves also created families, even if the law did not recognize their unions. Despite the harshness of the system, Roman slaves sought to build emotional bonds. Many formed stable unions, symbolically married, and started families. However, Roman law did not recognize these bonds. They were considered mere agreements between human property. This meant that at any moment, husbands, wives, or children could be sold separately, rupturing entire families without warning. The pain of separation was a constant part of slave life. Even so, these marriages represented silent resistance.
They were the slaves' way of preserving their humanity within a system that reduced them to objects. Exchanges of promises, small improvised rituals, and gestures of mutual care reinforced the idea that there was still room for affection. It was like planting flowers in stony soil, fragile but capable of bringing color to a bleak environment. Slave families lived in communal quarters, where each space was shared among several people. Children grew up in this environment, learning early on how to cope with hardship and responsibilities. Often the little ones' cries were muffled by the exhaustion of their parents who returned from long workdays. However, there were also moments of tenderness, such as stories told at night or soft songs to lull them to sleep. The risk of separation was ever present. All it took was a single decision from the master for a child to be sold or a couple to be separated. This constant insecurity shaped affections, which became intense precisely because of their fragility. Imagine loving someone knowing that any day could be your last with them. This awareness made each moment even more precious, but also painfully uncertain. Interestingly, some masters allowed marriages between slaves, partly as a way to keep them more docile and stable. At the same time, they knew that these bonds reinforced obedience, as a slave with a family had more to lose. It was a control strategy disguised as a concession. The system even exploited affection, transforming it into a tool of discipline. Thus, although lacking legal status, slave families revealed the strength of humanity in the face of oppression. Even lacking legal recognition, they existed, resisted, and left deep emotional scars. But in the eyes of Roman society, these bonds mattered little. Slaves continued to be seen not as people but as property, cogs in a system that naturalized inequality.
In the Roman mindset, a slave was not an individual, but a possession. They were listed alongside tools, animals, and land as part of a citizen's heritage. This cultural view reduced people to objects of economic value, erasing their stories, feelings, and desires. For the Romans, questioning this was almost unthinkable. It was as if the very idea of humanity were reserved only for the free, while slaves existed only to serve. This perception was evident in the vocabulary of the time. Slaves were called instrumenta vocalia, speaking instrument. The expression revealed a cruel logic. They were useful tools, but they had a voice. It's as if the mere fact of speaking wasn't enough to be recognized as human. This worldview justified abuse and naturalized violence, transforming exploitation into something acceptable in the eyes of society. In everyday life, this meant living without identity. Slaves were rarely called by their own name. They were given imposed nicknames, often linked to their function or origin. It was as if their essence was nullified and replaced by label. Imagine spending your life being called not by who you are, but by what you do. Cook, porter, guard. This reduction was a way of erasing individuality. Dehumanization also appeared in the law. Slaves had no rights of their own, could not testify in court without being tortured, and had no property. They were officially chattel. This legal structure reinforced the cultural perception. This was not injustice, but a natural order, according to the mentality of the time. Society accepted as truth what we now recognize as brutality. However, paradoxically, the Romans also recognized the indispensable usefulness of slaves. This contradiction created an ambiguous perspective. They were seen as inferior, yet absolutely necessary. It was a mixture of contempt and dependence. Something similar still occurs today in certain contexts, when professions essential to the functioning of society are devalued and rendered invisible. Thus, culturally, the slave was nothing more than property, an extension of his owner's wealth. This view sustained centuries of exploitation, until political, religious, and social changes began to slowly erode this system. And in the late Empire, signs of transformation already pointed to the gradual weakening of slavery. As the centuries passed, slavery in Rome began to change, especially during the late Empire. The system that had sustained Roman expansion and power began to show signs of wear and tear. The availability of new slaves diminished, as military conquests became less frequent. Without constant warfare, there were no mass prisoners taken, and the human trade began to wane. It was the beginning of a slow but inevitable transition. In this context, large estates became increasingly dependent on the labor of colonos, free peasants, who, in exchange for protection and land to cultivate, accepted conditions bordering on serfdom. This change did not signify the end of exploitation, but rather an adaptation to new circumstances. Forced labor continued, albeit in different forms, which would later give rise to the medieval feudal system. Another important factor was the influence of Christianity. As the religion grew within the empire, ideas about spiritual equality and human dignity emerged, albeit selectively applied. The church did not abolish slavery outright, but it helped to soften certain practices and gradually question the brutality of the system. Sermons and writings began to propose that slaves should be treated more humanely. Laws also followed these changes. Some restrictions began to be imposed on extreme abuse by masters, and manumission became more encouraged. Of course, these measures were far from representing full freedom, but they showed that the system was no longer as solid as it once was. Rome was beginning to recognize that slavery in its most brutal form was unsustainable. Despite this, The transition was slow and uneven. In many regions, slavery remained strong until the end of the empire, coexisting with new forms of dependent labor. The transformation was not marked by a single decree, but by centuries of adjustments, tensions, and adaptations. It was like a wall being eroded by time. It didn't fall all at once, but stone by stone. Thus, in the late empire, slavery ceased to be the sole basis of labor and began to be diluted by other forms of dependency. The Roman world entered a new cycle, but the scars of slavery would remain for centuries, influencing social structures long after the fall of Rome. After learning in detail about the lives of slaves in Rome, it's difficult to look back at the grandeur of the empire without remembering the price paid. But here's the most important point. It's not enough to just learn history. You need to use it as a mirror. How many times have you felt trapped in routines, jobs, or debts that limit you? How many times have you realized that your freedom is less than you'd like? Roman slavery may be over, but many forms of modern imprisonment still exist. Mental, emotional, financial. The difference is that today you can choose to break these chains. The question is, will you conform to the role you've been given, or will you write your own story of freedom? Think about it. What concrete steps can you take this week to become more independent? Read a book that broadens your horizons. Save money for a personal project. Learn a new skill. Action is the key that separates those who remain stuck from those who build a different life. And I want to hear from you. What was the biggest insight you learned from this video? Share it in the comments, because your learning might inspire others here too. And of course, if you want to continue learning about history in a different way, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. That way, with each new video, you'll be better prepared to see the world through different eyes and maybe even change your own life.